So I've gotten to the point these days where I feel like I'm not making any progress. And I know that's a terrible word, progress, because, you know, spirituality is not supposed to be about goals, um, achievement, obtainment of enlightenment. All of that stuff implies effort. And so, I understand that's counterproductive in this endeavor. But I feel like I'm at a point where I've looked so deeply into myself and understood so much about the nature of the self, the ego. And I feel like I've seen pretty much everything. It doesn't mean that there are certain things that are still active. It doesn't mean that psychologically I'm completely flattened. Things do still occur. But for the most part, when these efforts of the self are made, they're typically seen pretty quickly and just kind of dissipate and don't sort of gain any real traction. And I think that comes from, not really being invested in all these things that I've seen as the various activities of the self. Every once in a while something happens, particularly at work, or I get angry, and that anger kind of sets in and I get really upset about something. It's usually something along the lines of not being treated fairly, or thinking things should be done a different way, and that leads to anger. Those are the things that lead to anger, and usually it's when I'm thinking about those things. So every once in a while something really takes hold, and it kind of reminds me that in some ways I wonder if that passive self-awareness that I've developed over the last several years, perhaps it never really ends. Maybe that's a process that just continues indefinitely. And that sounds like sort of could be a bad thing. Sounds exhausting. But when you're really invested in this stuff, I feel like there's not an effort to be passive self-aware. It's not something that I am trying to do. It actually seems like it occurs rather automatically at this point. And when it does occur, it's actually a release of effort, not an investment in effort. But I've gotten to the point now where, those times when things are really potent are pretty rare. And so now I'm sort of at this point where I feel like I've just kind of stalled. I just sort of muddle through my days. It's fairly peaceful, fairly quiet. I'm probably the most sane I've ever been. And yet there is no grand illumination, some sort of sacred experience that apparently I've been working towards all along. And is that part of the problem? And I've looked into that. Do I have in my head this goal, this picture of what enlightenment would be, and do I want that? And I've seen that, and I've seen myself create or imagine what enlightenment, what finding the essence of life would be like, and I've seen myself imagine those things with that urge to want it. And I understand that. I understand that that's a possibility. And I don't think that's it. So, though I think it is possible to deceive yourself in thinking those sorts of thoughts. It's also possible that that's just not occurring, and I've become so aware of all these processes that I don't think that's it. I think it's just I've gotten to a point now where I feel like I'm in a sort of purgatory with this whole endeavor. And I think it's also difficult to really gauge where one is in this process, because this process is a process of losing things, not gaining things. Many of others have said this. And so when you understand, for example, your impatience, when you see that erupting and you're passively aware of it, and you see how it, next time it erupts, there's less effort involved. You're aware of it earlier and earlier in its process. At some point, it just doesn't occur. And that's a wonderful thing, to be standing in line at the grocery store and not have that feeling of, that inner feeling of anxiety, impatience, frustration. You know, you've seen how that occurs, and people can change internally. I've seen it within myself. But that being said, the goal in my mind is nothing. The goal is things not occurring. I know that sounds weird for that to be a goal, but I think that's the truth. So how do you gauge how far you've come? How can you tell how much left is there to do when the things that need to be contended with don't occur, and you don't even realize that, hey, maybe 6 months ago something would have occurred there that doesn't occur now. All you know is your life, and all you know is things that are occurring now. Any little budge that the self makes in any particular circumstance. So, you know, aside from continuing to be observant of myself, I'm not sure what else there is I can do. And there's never been anything that you can do, that you can consciously do, at least not in my experience. The passivity of this inner work would make me think that, no, there's nothing that I can do to push along this process, and any desire that I have to push the process along is just that. It's a desire, it's part of the ego, it's part of that self trying to get involved, trying to help you. And so I will just continue to hang around and live and be aware of any of these processes. But the way I feel right now is a lack of motivation. And that makes sense if the self motivates you to do things in your life. You think about going to the beach, and there's that effort involved in that in that thought. Like, yeah, I want to do that. And that's how we decide to do things in life. Then, you know, if I don't have very much of that, then, you know, I'm feeling kind of unmotivated and a little lazy. And I'm aware of the fact that, you know, laziness, you know, that's something that people use to criticize each other in our society. And so being aware of that self-critical, don't be lazy, that's more of the self. So all of these things I'm aware of and looking into, and yet at the same time I'm in this place of kind of a nothingness. And it leads me to wonder if there really is anything sacred. And Krishnamurti had asked that very question. He would talk about that a lot. Highly recommend Krishnamurti. A lot of my thoughts about spirituality, especially earlier on, were based on his teachings. You know, is there anything truly sacred? Is it really possible to understand some sort of source, understand God. And I know there are plenty of people around saying, yes, but I don't know. There's always the possibility people could be fooling themselves. And people can really deceive themselves. The mind can deceive you into thinking you've experienced something that maybe isn't true. So whatever happened to anybody else is really not of tremendous importance to this endeavor that I've undertaken. And taking someone else's word for it does nothing for me. And talking about it does nothing for me. Which is why I don't talk about things that I haven't realized. I don't talk about what God is, what enlightenment is, how there's no person here. I don't talk about things that I don't truly, sincerely, that I haven't realized. So there's really no answer to any of this, and that's usually a very intelligent way to undergo these sorts of questions, is to not really come up with an answer, but just understand that, continuing to sort of question and think about and look into something like this is what this whole endeavor is about.